Let's just start with the Liberal plan, and we talked about all of that new spending that was announced this week. What was your reaction to that?
Well, first reaction, John, was it's good to get some numbers like in an economic and fiscal table sort of format, so we can see, see what the cost, see what the line items are going to cost, see how they roll out, and then have like a balance sheet that we can look at. So what does this mean for the deficit and debt track, over the medium term? So that's the first reaction. It's good to see. I'm sure we're going to see it from the Conservatives in the next day or two, and hopefully from the Liberals, or sort of the NDP as well.
And I guess when it comes to trying to make an early assessment of who seems to be putting forward the most fiscally responsible plan, have you reached any conclusions on that?
No, and to be honest, we'll wait and see. The Conservative costed plan, like put in a fiscal planning framework, the NDP plan as well. Maybe we'll see something from the Greens, over the next week or two. So I think it's still too early, though. To be honest, like we can definitely talk about the Liberal plan because now we have the numbers.
And what were some of the things that stood out to you? Let's just bring up the concept of a balanced budget, which we've gotten so far away from because we were living through this pandemic and there was a lot of support in the depths of the pandemic for spending, but it has left us deep in the red. What feeling do you have about even that concept of a balanced budget in the near future?
Well, I think that, there's nothing magical to a balanced budget. I think from a public finance economist perspective, it really depends where is the economy, with regards to the economic cycle. And obviously, right now we're still on a year-over-year basis. The economy is still quite weak. We're still negative territory. Same with employment. So an economist, a public finance person says it's totally natural to expect budgetary deficits in this period of time. But as we move to the medium term and, the economy gets back up to trend, then again, we need to have strong arguments. Do we need to be running structural deficits? So these are deficits that exist even when the economy is operating at potential. In the Liberal plan, over 5 years, the deficit gets down to 1 percentage point of GDP. The economy is probably operating at a trend there. So there's definitely a structural deficit. They're going to argue, they will argue, or public finance people will likely argue that in a world of very low interest rates, and growing GDP, that that's an affordable, sustainable plan. It's so not the same environment as the 90s and the 80s, John, which I lived through.
And we're not going to date ourselves here, but I do love looking at history and certainly looking at recoveries. And we've been looking at the charts this week, Kevin. In fact, one of the big themes we talked about here on B&M Bloomberg was a disappointing second quarter GDP print. I think a lot of people are trying to figure out what the recovery is actually going to look like. And I wonder if some of the estimates that we're seeing from all parties might end up being too optimistic if we don't quite get the exact recovery we're looking for, and I'm curious to know what you think about that, particularly on the fiscal side or on the spending side.
Yeah, so there's definitely risk around the recovery. This is, it's just, an unusual time. It's not the same as the kind of recessions that we had in the early 80s, early 90s, or even the global financial crisis in 2009. So, what will be the nature of the recovery? Right now, the forecasts that are used by the Liberals, the Parliamentary Budget Office forecast, fairly optimistic, very similar to the Bank of Canada with respect to a very strong second half. Again, I think the numbers for the second quarter, like the projections for July are still in weak territory. All this is really contingent on what happens to the public health issue. That to what extent will we be able to deal with the Delta variant with growing vaccinations? So if we can't open up the economy because of the public health crisis the way we would like to, then I think there is some definitely downside risk on GDP. No, those deficit numbers, they will be higher, and we'll probably see more support programs into 2022.
And one thing, or one reason I think BNM Bloomberg is invaluable in this dialogue is because at the start of the hour, or at the start of this break, we talked about, we heard from all these different CEOs. These are people who are actually running businesses. These are people who have had to navigate the ups and downs of reopenings. And you heard a lot of voices there talking about their concern on the spending at the federal level, the open checkbook concept. Aren't these the people who are making the big business decisions? And if they've got some concerns about it, shouldn't we be paying more attention to that as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, businesses are going to look to these platforms and then and to see whether or not there is what is the plan, the strategy to manage the recovery, how will they manage finances in the post-COVID world. And if uncertainty goes up, then I think that's obviously going to be bad for business investment. So we definitely need to hear through mechanisms like Bloomberg what are business people saying. And we should analyze the spending tracks for all these different parties in a very transparent fashion.
Okay, so obviously in the next few days and certainly in these next couple of weeks, we're going to get a more robust dialogue. You alluded to some of the things, Kevin, that you're watching for, particularly with other parties, let's say the Conservatives. But on the simplest level, because this can get confusing, especially when voters have a lot on their minds right now, what do you think is paramount for these politicians? What kind of messaging would you be advising any of these parties when it comes to this issue? Because at the end of the day, all Canadians have to pay the bill down the road.
Yeah, so if it's, in terms of this issue, just with a fiscal lens, like I think like what we did see in the Liberals platform, and it's a positive thing, and I'm sure we'll see something more similar in the Conservatives and NDP is a declining deficit track. When in fact the Liberals basically saying that will become a fiscal rule. Declining debt to GDP ratio, like over the next number of years, that's an important fiscal rule. And then I think we need to debate, where's, with respect to the net spending, is this really value for money? And so, we can look at the $78 billion. A lot of that's going to go to healthcare. Is that where we want that money to go? Some of it will go to housing and seniors and First Nations people. Is there enough money to support, adjustment for the business sector with respect to energy transition? These are open questions. But definitely, with respect to fiscal rules and targets, declining deficit tracks, annual deficit tracks that we can hold the government to account, a declining debt to GDP ratio, very important over the medium term.